In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to use your bike to your advantage out on a trail. How to use all that technology that's part of your bike to basically help you be a better rider. Now, don't forget, Neil and the others over on GMBN have loads of videos on the specifics of how to get the most out of your bike on the trail. But today, I want to show you how the technical features on your bike can be dialed in and used to their biggest benefit. Now, the biggest bit of tech on your bike for making a difference to how you ride is your tyres. And the biggest thing you want to do is play with your tyre pressure. Now, whatever tyre brand or style of tread you have, this is something you can do that costs you nothing that will improve the way that you ride a bike. If you're running too much pressure in your tyres, it might feel like the bike is reacting faster and zipping along the terrain nicely, but you'll notice you're feeling the bumps more and you're actually going to be sliding around more. So by tailoring your tyre pressure to the terrain you're riding, you can get loads more traction, and actually lowering your tyre pressure basically reduces that rolling resistance. As soon as the bike is bouncing off things, you're going slower. You want the bike to keep on rolling. Lowering the tyre pressure does that. Now, of course, there are some limitations to doing this. Now, if you've got very thin tyres, for example, like cross-country tyres or just maybe slightly more budget tyres, there's going to be a limit to this. If they're very thin, you run the risk of doing what's called a pinch puncture or a snake bite. And what happens then is either your inner tube on the inside or the actual tyre itself is split by the rim impacting against the floor. They're basically cookie cutters against the tyre, causing a split in there. It's known as the snake bite because sometimes you get two little marks on there, like a snake bite on your inner tube. Now, of course, with tubeless tyres, this is reduced, but you can still damage the tyre. So there's a few ways around this. The first option would be running some kind of insert. This is obviously just a bit that I've cut off an insert. They're super lightweight. I mean, there's different styles you can get. They run on the inside of your tyre, and they're specifically designed to help basically prevent the rim bottoming out against the tyre when you're hitting an object. So it is going to enable you to run slightly lower pressures and give you a bit of support. But I'm not actually running inserts in these tyres. They do actually have a bit of sidewall support on them, so I can play with tyre pressure. But what you really need to do is experiment with is a pump, and every mountain biker should have one of those. Now, if you want to be a bit more precise, get yourself a digital gauge and really start practicing. Now, this section of trail here is fairly typical in the UK. It's just got a bunch of roots on it. Now, of course, line choice is the most important thing that any mountain biker knows. You don't really want to go across roots at an angle. You want to try and hit them square on as possible, but it's not always something that you can do on a section of trail. So playing with your tyre pressure enables you to really get the most. You're spreading the tyre around the object rather than it sliding away from you. Now, this tyre says I can run between 20 and 40 PSI on here. Now, this run was on 30 PSI and you can see them sliding around. So I'm going to lower them down to 20 just to show you how much additional grip you can get by the tyre conforming over things. Play with it. I promise you, you'll get some really good feeling out of your bike if you're willing to persist and play with tyre pressure. So as I was saying, tyre pressure is the single biggest thing that you can do to change how your bike handles on terrain like this. Now, of course, when you're hitting a route like this and you're running a firmer tyre, there's a really good chance that the tyre literally is just going to slide at an angle. You're putting pressure on, and this tyre, as you can see, is hard enough that it's not really deforming much. So with a bit of pressure, what's going to happen with a bit of power under here, as you can see from the state of this route, is your wheel is literally just going to slide to the side. Now, it's up to you how you manage that. Now, part of your line choice is trying to pick your way around this sort of stuff. And if you've got clip-in pedals, which we'll deal with in clip-in pedals, you can actually lift your bike or unweight it on things like this. However, free traction can be had from just simply lowering your tyre pressure. So I'm just going to let some tyre pressure out and just show you the difference of like trying to conform the tyre to this. It's not going to happen. You can see it just wants to slide. Now if I let some air out, so note now that when, bear in mind, this is just me loading this up. See how much more the tyre actually wants to conform around the object, and there is instantly so much more traction that can be had. So you've got a larger surface on the thing you're actually trying to ride over. Okay, pedals. Right, there's two major types, flat pedals and clipless pedals. Now, despite what anyone tells you, One of them isn't better than the other. They both have advantages and they're both excellent for mountain biking. However, clipping into the bike itself does have some advantages you can't get with flat pedals, some real good technical advantages. So in climbing, it means that you can be very light on the bike and it's easier to maintain traction. Because of the fact you're attached to it, if you hit your feet, for example, on a rock or a route when you're climbing, you're not going to dislodge your feet from the pedals, you can just keep on going. It also means when you're riding on wet, rooty terrain like this, when you wheel spin and things like that, you can basically lift your rear wheel up and over the objects very easily. You can do it on flat pedals, but it requires a lot more planning as you're riding. With these, it's a bit more crisis management. You can just truck on through and move the bike around as you're climbing. It's a brilliant feature. And with descending, there's also some advantages to be had. The same thing, you can move the bike around a lot easier because you're part of it. So you're expending less energy holding onto the bike. So this is good because it's easier on your arms, but it's also good because it's easier on your bike. Flat pedal riders tend to be quite hard on the back end of bikes. They tend to hang off the back a bit more. And also it means you're just lighter on the bike overall. So you're less likely to break traction. So there's a load of good things to be had from being attached to it. Now this little rock step is the perfect example of how clipping in can help. So I'm just going to basically carry on pedaling as I ride along the trail. But there's two disadvantages of clipping in. One of them is you can get a bit lazy as a rider. You can start to rely on them. So whilst they are excellent and offer you loads of technical advantages you can't get on flat pedals, you should also learn to ride flat pedals so you can be a more balanced rider. And the other one is they can be scary at times. At low speed on the technical stuff, they're scary because you feel like you're going to fall over and not clip out in time. And when you're flying down wet, rooty stuff, it's a commitment thing. But you'll find that like clipless pedals, they are brilliant. One thing I particularly like, especially on bikes like this with a lot of travel, when you're climbing, you tend to hit your feet on the floor quite a lot. And I know when you do this on flat pedals, you lose your footing quite easily. With clipless pedals, that doesn't happen. In fact, you can even see I've struck this crank a few times today and I didn't even really notice, just carried on riding. It's a major benefit of technical riding with clipless pedals. Dropper posts. One of the coolest bits of tech on a mountain bike. No doubt they can improve your flow when going gets tricky when you're going down. Obviously you can slam your saddle down, push button, it comes back up, right? But the problem is most people either run the saddle fully high or fully all the way down. But one of the biggest advantages you can get from a dropper post is running it about halfway or even just an inch or so lower than your maximum height. That enables you to tackle technical terrain like riding up through a bomb hole like this, over some roots. It enables you to hover over the saddle, but it's still slightly out the way. It's a really efficient way of riding a bike. And when you need to get the power down, you've only just got a tiny bit more to crank it back up again. It's really good. Try it on a section of technical terrain where you can just hover between being just above the saddle and in the saddle and still enabling yourself to move around. It's much better than a saddle at full height. And of course, if you're trying the same thing with a saddle fully down, it's just gonna be a lot harder on your legs. So give it a try. Halfway up works a treat. Okay, so one extra little tech tip here. If you don't have a dropper post and you want to get good at riding technical terrain, we have to move around on a bike a lot and you're finding the saddle's constricting you by being at full height, try lowering it. Just a little bit, maybe an inch or so. Now, if you look at the top cross-country races, someone like Nino Schurter, for example, never runs his saddle at the optimum pedaling height. So a little bit lower, so it's still okay on his knees, he still gets efficiency from his legs, but the saddle's out of the way just enough that he can maintain power on this sort of terrain. Suspension by far is my favourite tech thing on any mountain bike, and it's the thing that you can get the most out of to really help you on the trail, whether you've just got front suspension or you've got full suspension bike like this one. Now they're incredibly easy to set up, yet we still see a lot of people with their bikes not set up correctly. So you could be running your bike too soft, for example. If it's too soft, you're going to be fighting that suspension the whole time when you're pedaling. And also, it's not going to be doing its job properly when you jump off things or you hit bumps and rough stuff in the trail. It can actually make the bike quite hard to control. The opposite could be said if the bike is too firm for you. So if you're running a really firm suspension bike, it might feel great to pedal, but as soon as you start riding into rough terrain, the bike's not going to track the ground. It'll actually feel quite hard to handle. The only exception for this is if you're an exceptionally good or fast rider, in which case the faster you go, the firmer you're going to need your suspension to be in order to resist using it all the time, but that's a bit more advanced. Now, most manufacturers recommend 20 to 30% of the available travel as sag, and they all have good guide base settings. Start there and then figure it out. Now, when it comes to adjusting your damping, again, it's really good to stick to your manufacturer's base settings and then figure it out from there. Now, I don't tend to change too many things on my bike. I might mess around with the low speed compression. That is effectively your climbing switch on the rear, and I'll explain that when we get into the climbing section of this video. And sometimes I'll add a little bit of rebound damping on when I'm riding things like these jumps. Now, I'm quite heavy, so I don't like the feeling if I go through the travel and the bike wants to kick me. Now, this is a fairly common feeling you can get when learning jumps. Having an extra bit of rebound damping can slow down the bike as it compresses and extends off a jump and make the bike feel a little bit nicer to ride. As far as compression goes, a lot of riders don't run too much compression because they want the bike to feel nice and lively. That's great, but if you're starting to go through the travel too much, too often, you might want to be adding a bit of compression on there. Now, on drop-offs like this, you would be expecting to use most of your travel. Now, I've probably got about a centimetre left, maybe half a centimetre left before bottoming out, so that's a pretty good sign. The bike is nicely in control. However, if you are just smashing through the travel and your bike does feel a bit out of control here, either your fork's a little bit soft or perhaps you've not got enough compression damping on it. Now, if your bike has adjustable high-speed compression, this is where it comes in. So some people get confused between low-speed compression and high-speed. Low speed is referring to the shaft movement, i.e. so that's going to be to body weight, things like that when you're pedaling. High speed is impact. So if you put a little bit more, think of it as impact compression. Yeah, so you can add on a few more clicks, but don't go too far. If you put too many clicks on, it can feel harsh. But get it right and your bike can feel amazing on stuff like this. And look how well the suspension on the front of my bike is working here. Now, bear in mind, I'm using literally base settings. So this is what RockShox recommend. And look at the front wheel tracking the ground. So I've just landed from a drop. It's used nearly all the travel. I'm on the brakes here, slowing down for a right-hand turn. And you can still see the fork tracking, like letting the wheel track the ground. That is suspension really helping you riding. So I just said that I like to run a couple of clicks of rebound to keep the back end controlled. Now, if you're a heavier rider or if you're struggling with your jumping, you're finding you're having to crank on even more and the bike starts feeling really like sluggish because of that, try another thing. Try running your bike in the mid setting if you've got adjustable rear suspension. So many adjustable rear shocks have 3 positions on them. Have a little lever like this one. If you run it in the mid setting, that adds low speed compression. And the effect that has when you're pushing into a takeoff is you'll use less travel. If you're using less travel, that's less energy for the rebound damping to control as it extends. So basically you won't have to have as much rebound in order to make the bike feel nicer in the air. So have a little play with that. It's really important to practice these sorts of things instead of just steaming straight into a set of jumps. Now, if you want to learn more about jumping, of course, there's going to be a video in the description underneath where you can learn everything about jumping from the folk over at GMBN. So the geometry on all bikes can be used to your advantage. Now I'm going to use this bike as an example of a modern geometry bicycle, and I'm going to show you why some of the things on it are so good for mountain biking and some workarounds if need be for your own riding. Now let's talk about climbing first. Now it's quite documented at the moment that you have a steeper seat angle and it puts you in a better position for climbing. So why exactly is that? Okay, so if you have a slack seat angle, when your saddle is up, your seat is going to be really far towards the back of the bike. Now, it's really important in climbing to have weight on your rear wheel for traction, but you also need to have enough weight on the front end for control. Otherwise, firstly, you're not going to be able to keep a line. You're going to be wandering around all over the place trying to fight that. And secondly, you're going to be wasting loads of energy on your arms, which hear me out here, you use more than just your legs when you're climbing, you're using your whole body. And if you're using energy in your arms trying to keep the front end on the ground, you're not in an efficient climbing position. So a steeper seat angle really does make a difference. Now, this bike has a steep seat angle. Look at where my saddle is, where it's down, and when I put it up, look how much further back it is. So just to put this into perspective, the seat angle effectively is aligned from the bottom bracket axle to the top of the seat tube, okay? So ignoring the fact this one's curved, that can be a bit of an illusion. That is a pretty steep seat angle. So you just think, if I have a slack seat angle, the slacker it gets, really the worse the climbing is going to get when you're seated on a bike. It really does make a massive difference when you're climbing. I can't emphasize that. And it can make the difference between, you know, a big travel bike like this, anything from 140 to 180 mil travel, it can make a difference between it climbing well and climbing like a pig. Because something else that happens with a slack seat angle, regardless of suspension design, is you'll be wrenching on the bike so hard trying to put your power down that you'll literally be just compressing the suspension like a pair of scissors as you go up the hill. Now, I've had this on bikes that don't fit me in the past, and I've had to have the rear shock, the compression tune adjusted on it, so it basically sits up quite a lot when I pedal. So that's just something to take into account there. Now, if your bike doesn't have a steep seat angle on it, you can have a few little hacks to get around this. One of them is by putting your saddle as far forwards as it will go on the rails, and by tipping it very slightly down at the front, enabling you to get further forwards. Just think, the more neutral you are on the bike, you know, your weight bias between the wheels, the better it is for climbing. Now, one of the things with good modern geometry with this steeper seat angle, like I said, puts me in a great position. I'm not having to do anything to weight that front wheel for control, and I've got plenty of traction on the back. Like, look how neutral my position is between the two. It really does make a huge difference. Now, like I said, you can put your saddle forward slightly to try and simulate this. It's definitely worth experimenting with. But you might be wondering why all bikes don't have a steep seat angle on them. Well, to accommodate a steep seat angle, you accordingly have to grow proportionally the front end of the bike, otherwise you'll end up with a bike that's very short in the top tube because that angle is coming further and further. And a long bike isn't always appropriate, despite what long bike fans will tell you. So for example, a cross-country bike that only has 100 millimeters of travel, you can't make a bike like that ridiculously long because it just won't handle in the way that a cross-country racer needs it to. It needs to be ridiculously agile, it needs to be very responsive, and the sort of handling traits you get with a slightly shorter bike. I mean, bikes are getting longer, but they're not going to be as long as something like this. Now, the other really cool thing about a longer front end on a bike is I think you can start using trials maneuvers on really tight trails. And EWS racers seem to agree with me as well because, well, not they're listening to me, but they're already doing this. They're doing endo or stoppy turns around very tight switchbacks. Okay, so it is a bit more of an advanced thing to do, but the bikes for sure make it a lot easier to spin round on that front wheel thanks to that slack head angle. It's just far less scary pitching a bike up on the front wheel when it's that much further away from you. Well, that essentially is how you can use all of the tech to your best advantage out on the trail. Of course, it's not going to make you a better rider, it can just be used to your advantage. Now, if you want to see any of those specific riding videos I mentioned with Rich and Neil and Blake, they're going to be in the description underneath. And the same with the videos on GMBN Tech with the setup that's going to help you get there. Okay, so if there's anything else you want to see from us out on the trail here at GMBN Tech, let us know in those comments. We'll see you in the next video. Ta-ra!